Welcome, Soaring Sisters, to another episode. We're going to have our usual features, but we're mostly going to be focusing on something that arose out of my recent competing in the New South Wales State Gliding Championships. So stay tuned. Welcome, Soaring Sisters, to another episode. This episode, we're going to be focusing on some aspects that arose out of my competing in the New South Wales State Gliding Championships recently. As you can probably tell by my tan, I've spent quite a few weeks in the glider. I did 16 days in total up at Lake Keepit, practice days, and then the competition, which was over 7 days. Now, I surprised myself, given that I haven't been competing seriously for a very long time. I managed to get myself a second, a third, a fourth, and a fifth in club class before I completely blew everything by having a couple of really bad days. The worst day was the final day, and we will talk about managing fatigue in another episode, but it was really fatigue that led to that error, and what happened was I left a waypoint in that I meant to pull out, and so what happened was I actually missed the start point. I cannot believe that in the circling around and round I didn't accidentally cross it at some point, but I didn't. My start point was perpendicular to the actual start line, and so I flew parallel to the start line, having never crossed it. We'll talk some more about those kinds of lessons and 50 ways to lose your points. But I think it's worth sharing that Kerry Claffey, who some of you will know, said to me on the final evening, to win the task, you have to fly the task, the whole task, and nothing but the task. Anyway, as you can see, I've got a few little injuries. I find my fingernails don't survive weeks of gliding. Don't know about you, but anyway. So before we go on to that story, which actually arose out of a question from a friend of mine on social media, let's have a look at the news involving our Soaring Sisters. For those of you based in the UK who are members of the British Women's Pilots Association, there is an online event about the Women's World Gliding Championships, the 10th FAI Women's World Gliding Championships, which were held in Australia, and the lovely Claudia Hill is presenting that. Claudia is not only a fabulous person, she's a great glider pilot. She's one of the top female glider pilots in the world. She flew as a member of the British gliding team at the WWGC in Australia in January 2020. And as the blurb says, expect amazing scenery and wildlife, lots of gliders, and an introduction to what the Women's World Gliding Championship is all about. Now, if you're a pilot and you're not a member of the British Women's Pilots Association, I would highly recommend that you become a member. I am a member of the equivalent Australian organisation, the Australian Women's Pilots Association, and that and the British Association are open to people with a full pilot's licence, hang gliding or paragliding, club pilot, and so on and so forth. So get over there, join up the British Women's Pilots Association, and sign up to that online event and hear from the lovely Claudia Hill. Now, while we're talking about Claudia, do go over to her Claudia Hill's gliding page on Facebook. Just look for Claudia Hill's gliding page, and take a look at some of the images and photographs there. I'm going to share with you now, with her permission, a video of pretty much what the typical end of day looked like at the Women's World Gliding Championships in Lake Keepit. As I said, we were in the middle of a drought. There were massive bushfires. The whole country was on fire. And I have never seen the place as dry and dusty as it was then. It's actually really lovely now. There's water in the lake. The grass is green on the airfield. The kangaroos are even more numerous. But take a look at this video from Claudia from that particular event. And by the way, sorry Claudia for messaging you at 4 o'clock in the morning, but nice that you replied. I hope you had a great day after that. Now, before I go on and speak to the specific event that was the stimulus for this particular episode, I want to talk about something else in gliding that I think needs to be spoken about, and it's one of the reasons that I started this channel in the first place. There's a propensity in gliding and other similar pursuits for those who are in the know, if you like, to not recognize that it's awfully difficult to understand lots of aspects of our sport. It's not just that there's lots of knowledge required, it's that there's lots of meta knowledge required. For those of you not familiar with the term, meta knowledge is knowledge about knowledge. So, for instance, where do I find out these things? How do I begin to understand X, Y, or Z? Who do I talk to? Is this knowledge that other people possess? You know, all those kinds of things. And when you look at our sport, it tends to be one of the things that limits the beginner's participation. They see all of these layers of complexity and they don't really understand that this is something that they can easily do. Also, it limits the growth of individual pilots. We are often afraid to ask, and that's particularly so for women, to find out, how do we find out things? And so it's one of the reasons that, as I said, I started this channel. Now, the particular person who requested information or asked me a question relating to the error that I made on the last day of my of flying in the championships was a man, but his question was, did nobody observe your start? Can they not verify that you actually started? Well, there's a couple of problems with that question that point to the issue that I was speaking about, which is the issue of knowledge of, how do the organisers, contest directors, scorers, task setters and all that know what it is that we as pilots are doing during a competition? How do we as prospective competitors, particularly if we're beginners, know how to do what's required? How do we know what needs to be known about tasks and flying the tasks and starting and all of these things? I don't know about you, but none of that information has ever been shared with me. Nobody has ever come to me at any stage in my flying and said, this is how you do competition flying, this is how you put a task into your glide computer, whatever that glide computer might be, this is how you fly the task, this is how you do a start. These are all things that I had to find out myself by doing research or asking lots of questions. And I think that's an issue for our sport that's much deeper and needs some more conversation. but it extends to all kinds of things, from, the way that we teach the theory of cross-country flying versus the way that we actually race our gliders. So those of you who are competition pilots will of course know everything that needs to be known about McCready theory, and quite happy to abandon many aspects of it. So what chance some person who's like the young Tom Jamieson, who was in our competition, who said, I think I have just started to begin to understand McCready theory. And I think my response to him is, well, now you'll have to get rid of bits of it if you want to fly fast. Understanding lots of those complexities is probably a higher level conversation, but I think the person's question on my social media about, didn't somebody observe your start, points to the fact that the general public, and therefore the people that we would like to encourage to participate in our sport in the future, really have very little understanding of what it is that we do. And when we put things up on our social media, it often alienates people. And I was just looking, again to mention Claudia Hill, I was just looking at her Facebook page today and realised that she's got a statement in there about, if I speak in jargon or something, do ask me to explain. And I think that's something that we should all bear in mind. So my explanation to my friend was that, in fact, our races are recorded on instruments called data loggers that are generally built into our flight computers, though they can be separate. And our flight computers are what we use to enter the task into and verify that we're flying the task and do lots of other complexities. Basically our navigation system. And so in this particular case, the start point was about 18 kilometers, if I remember correctly, from the actual airfield. So even if there was someone who could verify a start, it wouldn't actually be possible. Now, those of you who've been around a long time will know, of course, that we used to actually have verification of our starts via radio by people observing the start on the ground. So, it's not a far-fetched question. It's just, its time has gone. So that was the impetus for me doing a very kind of simple explanation of what our tasks look like, and kind of a live fly-through of one of our tasks in club class, and a very brief look at the kinds of instruments that we use. And I should point out to you, those of you who are more advanced, that this is a very, very simple explanation, and we will move on to more complexities later on, but I have a bunch of episodes I want to cover before then. Things about, should I buy my own glider, and what's it like flying your first task, how do I plan it, and so forth. So let's go. So let's take a look at task 4 for the class that I flew in, which was the combined club standard and 15 metre class. So this was on day 4 of the New South Wales State Championships, and this particular task is what we call a racing or speed task. I will also show you very briefly what's called an assigned area task, or an AAT. And I will speak just briefly about the differences. So what happens is the weatherman and the task setter get together in the morning, and very early in the morning typically, and they will plan based on the weather that's expected for the day, a suitable length task that they believe that the fleet can complete given the different performances of all the gliders, bearing in mind that in this particular combined class there's quite a difference in performance. Now, we're all handicapped, but that doesn't change the fact that we actually have to finish the task in the given, a weather window, shall we say. So if there's, good soaring conditions for 3 or 4 hours of the day, then we have to be able to finish the task in that window of time. So the first thing to know about the task is they're very similar to sailing in the sense that they're often a course marked out with waypoints. And in the old days, we used to have to prove we rounded the waypoints by taking photographs from our aircraft, etc., etc. These days, it's all done via GPS. We have an instrument which we'll give you a brief look at and hopefully explain better in another video, that records our flight in terms of our position and our altitude and so forth, relative to these waypoints that are also in the device. Now, my friend was asking about, did anybody observe my particular start? Now, in days gone by, people did actually observe the start and call to you on the radio, Kilo Oscar, good start. But nowadays, it's all done via GPS, so nobody's actually watching us start. And although this task here shows the start line as corresponding to the finish line, which is the airport, sometimes the start line is remote. And in the case of the assigned area task that I'm going to show you, it was about 16 or 18 kilometers away. So there's no way that anybody could actually observe the start like they might have done in days gone by. In this particular case, our start was had to be below 8,000 feet. So what that means in practice is the first GPS point recorded after you cross the line must be below 8,000 feet. Now, this particular course is a triangle, and it goes up this rather nasty kind of country where there's not a lot of outlandings, across to this point here, across to this point here to the west, and then back down again. We'll talk about those points now. So the start is a waypoint designated in our files that the organisers share with us as 0.00, which is the Lake Keepit Soaring Club airstrip. The next turn point is 0.86, which is the airport for the township of Warialda, which is a small country town, about 150 kilometres further north. Then the third turn point is turn point 59, which is the airport for the town of Moree in northern New South Wales, roughly 67 kilometres west. And then return to Lake Keepit, 165 kilometres away. As you can see from these observation zones, the start line is a line 10 kilometres long, or radius of 5, which I'll explain in a minute. And the other turn points are designated by cylinders coming from the ground upwards to essentially infinite height, but whatever height the day is, of 0.5 kilometres or 500 metres radius. So they're a kilometre diameter cylinder that we can fly into. Now, let's go back and have a look at the start line. Although it's not shown very well on this diagram, you can see that the start line is in fact a line here, and it is 10 kilometres across. So as long as we cross that line, we're fine. Now, what happens with speed tasks or racing tasks and assigned area tasks is we are given a start window. In this case, the window had only an open time, not a closed time, although obviously it would close at sunset because it wouldn't be legal to fly. So we are free to start any time after the start window opens, and each individual glider pilot will decide by themselves what time they want to start based on whatever parameters they've set for themselves. Typically that would be their assumptions about the weather conditions and the speed at which they can fly. So typically, like for instance, on some days you might find that if you start too early, your average speed will be lower because you're not flying in the best weather. If you start later, it might be higher. Vice versa, if there's a weather change coming in and you start late, you might get caught in the weather change. Also, you need to consider whether or not you want to use other gliders as, if you like, a measure of your own performance, or in some cases a marker of the thermals. So on days when there are no clouds at the top of the thermals, it's useful to have other gliders around you, because they will mark the thermals for you. So when you have 6 or 7 gliders in the same location, roughly flying in the same direction, one of them encounters a thermal, all the others will go in and join. So that can be useful. But for the moment, just bear in mind that the start is after a set time. It has a set height, typically, in this case a maximum height, and we're free to start whenever we choose after that window opens. We fly typically as straight as we can, but that depends on the conditions that we find. In this case, many of us flew over to the east here, although the fastest were to the west. And in this particular case, there are good streaks of clouds on each of these ridges. And as I said, the western ridge was actually better than the eastern ridge. So when we come up to this turn point, we will turn anywhere inside that little 500 meter radius cylinder. If we turn early, we miss it and we have been deemed not to have made that turn point, which affects our result, obviously. If we go around the outside of it, we've also missed it. We have to literally fly through the cylinder. And the same, of course, for the other one. Now, these bigger circles that you see have nothing to do with the race itself. In this case, this is the, if you like, the airspace designation for the Warrialda airstrip. We don't fly in controlled airspace, but this is what's referred to as a CTAF area, if you like. So CTAF stands for Common Terminal Advisory Frequency, and it's the expectation or requirement that when you're entering the area that you will tell others where you are and what your intentions are. So as we enter this particular area, we would call on that CTAF frequency and tell other aircraft what is actually happening. Similarly here for Moree. So they don't have anything to do with the race specifically, they're just airspace limitations or airspace designations. If we come down here to Tamworth, this is a no-fly zone. This is actually, you know, class Bravo and so forth airspace. So we are not permitted to fly in that particular airspace, and in fact it would get you disqualified from the competition, as well as more serious repercussions, if you like. Okay, so that's a typical task. In this case, it's a triangle of about 382 kilometers roughly. Now, the thing to note about this particular task is everybody's flying the same distance. Start at different times, but flying the exact same distance. The aircraft are handicapped based on their well-published, performance data, and those handicaps have been fine-tuned over the years, so they're pretty good. So just like a sailing race, the lower performance gliders will have a benefit in terms of handicap, and the higher performance gliders will have a deficit in terms of handicap. So it's not just about the speed that you fly the course. What we're doing here is we're flying this course as fast as we can, and it's your average speed, that is the distance you flew. In this case, everybody flies the same distance, divided by your time, which gives you a speed. The handicap is applied to that speed, and so you will see gliders that actually fly slower can potentially win. Let's have a look at the results and see that in actual case. So here we are. I'm actually 5th, and I flew 95.4 kilometers per hour. And if you look above me, there's some interesting examples of what I spoke about The first place glider is an LS3, flew 107.95. Second place glider is a PIC-20, which flew 102.83. Third place flew faster than second place. But the ASW27 is a slightly higher performance glider than the PIC-20, and you can see that in the handicaps. Okay, so that's an example of the handicap being applied. So here's the raw speeds calculated from the elapsed time and the set distance of 381.97 kilometers. And so once you apply the handicap, a glider that has actually flown slower than another glider is actually in a better finishing position, if you like. They finish second rather than third. The 1,000-point system we'll go into in another video. It's highly complex, but in this particular case there were 1,000 points available for the day. The first finisher gets 1,000 and everybody gets something less than 1,000 points. So that's the task. Let's have a look at a assigned area task, if I can find one. Oh, that's not one. Day 6, perhaps? Yes, day 6. Okay, so let's have a look at it. It's a bit more complex, but the thing that you'll notice immediately is these larger circles. You'll also notice what I spoke about before. This start line is this little red line here is actually remote from the airfield. So we start here, we launch here and we climb and we try and get ourselves a good height to get over to the start line, which is 18 kilometers away. And then we're behind the start line here trying to climb to our maximum allowable height, in this case 8,000 feet, so that we can cross the start line and head off to our first turn point. In this case, it's the smaller of the two circles there, which is in fact a 10-kilometer circle. The other circles you can see are 40, 40 and 30 kilometers radius. Now, with an assigned area task, there are a couple of things to bear in mind. One is that you have a set time, a task duration, in this case 2 hours and 30 minutes. The other thing is that these turn points are not actually little cylinders like we saw before, but very large cylinders, and you're entitled to turn anywhere in that cylinder that you choose. Typically the size of the cylinders is set so that the fastest glider will not run out of space, if you like. They could fly to the far ends of the circle and not find themselves finishing early. Because you imagine if you flew from the start line to the far end of this circle, and the far end of the next circle, and the far end of the next circle, and the far end of the next circle, you would have flown the maximum possible distance. When you come back to the finish line, the last thing that you want is to be in a situation where where you're actually arriving earlier than the 2 hours 30 minutes, but you have no more distance available to you to fly. The problem with that is if you finish before 2 hours and 30 minutes, you'll be scored as though you finished in 2 hours and 30. So let's think about that for a minute. If you finish the task, say, in 2 hours, your average speed will be based on you finishing it in 2 hours and 30. So imagine your displeasure if you'd actually flown the maximum available distance and came home under time. So the circles are set so that the highest performance gliders won't run out of room, and they're also set so that the lowest performance gliders won't find themselves struggling to complete the distance. So in theory, the lowest performance glider could just touch the edges of each circle and get a valid time. So that's how it's worked out. There's also some advantage to AATs in particularly difficult circumstances, although that's not what they're intended for. So there you go, that's an assigned area task. As I said, if you finish early, you pay the penalty. If you finish after 2 hours and 30, let's say you finish in 4 hours, just by way of example, then your time will be calculated on 4 hours. If you finish in 2 hours and 35, your time will be based on 2 hours and 35. So you want to be finishing a little later than the 2 hours 30 elapsed time. 2 hours 35 or 2 hours 40 would be good. So the whole time that you're flying an assigned area task, you're trying to manage something called delta T, whether you're going to be over or under. So you keep calculating where you're going to fly to based on that. The other advantage of the AAT, if you like, is that you can determine where the best weather is in each of these circles or between each of these circles and adjust your turn points accordingly. So every glider flies to a different spot, basically. So that's an assigned area task. And in this case, you can see that the minimum distance was 180.68 kilometers, the maximum distance was 595.41, and the distance between the center of all the circles was 377.11 kilometers. So there you go. That's the two main types of tasks that you'll encounter. The other type of task that I'll mention just briefly is something called a Grand Prix task. Has the unique circumstance that all gliders start at the same time. So a bit like a car race. And it can have different size circles for handicapping purposes if there's a big difference in the performance of all the gliders, or it can be a racing task. So let's go back now and have a look at Task 4 again. What I'm going to show you now is essentially how we're flying the task. I'm going to take 3 different gliders and I'm going to show you the start and how we flew each of the legs, and I'll insert a little bit of video in various. Okay, so we've got a couple of gliders launching here and trying to climb away. Now this particular software would typically provide a 3D view over here of an animation of a glider in 3D, but I'm going to close that to speed up the operation. And we're just going to look at the map view at this point in time. Units are set to the Australian norm, apart from the speed, which is in kilometers per hour, which is how we calculate task speed, but when we're flying we work in knots. Australian glider pilots have a mixture of units. We measure our height in feet, our flying speed in knots, our task in kilometers, and our task speed in kilometers per hour, and our climb rate in feet per minute or knots. So quite a mixture. The math in your head is difficult to do, but that's how we used to do it. Nowadays we use computers. So I have crossed the start line, it appears. I wonder, have I genuinely crossed, or am I coming back? You can come back and start again. So that's my aircraft with Kilo Oscar. And the other aircraft are Christian Linnet and Tom Jamieson. Tom is a young pilot with only something like 70 hours when he started this particular competition. He's flying very well. So there we are, all 3 of us in the same thermal. Tom leaves. Started, but I've moved out on track. Getting close to cloud base. I'm gonna have to go back and start now. Take a climb near the start line. And there I go, restarted. These guys are still looking for climbs. Now, as I recall, this day was really quite difficult to start. In fact, there are at least one glider that landed out on this first leg in a rather difficult spot as well. So you can see Christian there in the yellow glider is already partway down the leg, and Tom is off to the east looking for lift. So as you can see, I started later than these guys and I've caught up with them, so to speak. So
it's a lot weaker than what's forecast.
That's a good result.
A lot of clouds, but not much climb.
But it really was quite difficult going at this point. So roughly around the same height here, about mid-7,000. Christian is already starting to connect with this low ridge that was here. And at this point I'm trailing behind. As you can see, I had a bit of trouble with that thermal.
Well, you're probably around the turn, right?
Negative on
44.
So now those two guys are getting a pretty good run. I've sort of crossed over to the other side of the valley because I figured out that the eastern side wasn't working quite as well, I thought. At this point in time, I'm flying into wind. The other two gliders have made the turn at Warialda. You can see I tracked to the south because I figured there was better energy to the south, and you can see that Tom had done the same. So I'm getting a pretty good run at this point. Those two guys are very close together again. What are our heights? Still around the 8,000 mark. I'm at nearly 9,000, dropping. Those two fellows have turned Moree and they're flying pretty much together. They're in the same thermal there. Tom had a better climb. I do an odd turn there at Moree, but that was because of the traffic that was coming out of that particular airport. So now as we head towards the green here, this green is a mountain range, and we have to get high enough to get over the top of that mountain range. You see our relative positions haven't changed an awful lot, but Tom is getting ahead of Christian. As he heads now over the top of the mountain. And I'm back there trying to get some height. Christian's over the top of the mountain. Now I'm crossing. Take a climb at the top. I was down to 6.5 roughly. So now we're all looking for final glide. Probably about 70 or 80 kilometers out from home. Those two guys are together again. I would think they must be close to final glide. Looks like they are. So there you go. Tom is home. Christian is home shortly afterwards. And then I'm coming home as well. So there you go. That's how we fly the task. Now I know that was a really long video, one of the longest I've made, and probably not of a huge amount of interest in terms of the detail for those of us with more experience. But I think we have to bear in mind that there's an incredible amount of meta-knowledge that I think is limiting the growth of the sport. And I think we all could do better to think about how we ensure people know how to learn about the things that they need to learn about in order to become better pilots, whatever that means for them, whatever aspect of the sport they want to get involved in. Or even for those who, like my friend, knows an awful lot about aviation, but not an awful lot about gliding. And when I posted on the social media that I'd had a difficult start and it looked like my start wasn't verified, I had a very valid question about how can that possibly happen. So I think we should all very much think about how we share knowledge and how we explain things so that we can continue to attract more people to the sport that we love. I'm Kimberly Olsen. Catch you next time.